when I think I've talked myself out on this particular picture and so forth, is that when you want to cut it off and go to another one?
No, you just go on to your next picture.
Well, I got to get them. I don't have any.
Well, I mean, once you've gone through these three, I mean, after the third one, then say that's it for that one.
Yeah.
And then I'll stop it. We'll
All
just
right.
go through them
All right.
like 3
Okay.
or 5 at a time.
Well, now wait a minute. Do you think you can get this?
Yeah, it's about the same size as the other one. I can get it. Do you want to start?
Well,
with that one?
that's number one then.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we just saw you put it on there, so talk about it.
Oh, all right. Well, this is a very early picture of my grandfather and grandma Franzen. This was, I think it's their marriage picture, which is, it just fell down a bit. I hope it's still in the frame. But I would say that's got to be probably 1875 or somewhere. I don't know the exact date of their marriage, but I have some later ones. This is after they've had their 4 children, and they're fairly well grown. The oldest is John. He's in the middle, and I don't know what his age is at the time there, probably 15 or 16 the way it looks. On his right is Uncle Hugo, and over on his left, the little girl is my mother, Alma, and in front is Uncle Ed, who is the youngest, and of course the lady on the extreme left is my grandmother, and on the extreme right my grandfather Franzen. Now we've got a still later one of the 2 of them, and that's this one. This was taken at their 51st wedding anniversary, not at their anniversary, but because of their anniversary. And I was at that time on the Democrat newspaper in Davenport, and so I photographed that for the newspaper. And that is the way I remember the most, is looking like that, of course, because it was during my childhood and adulthood that they looked somewhere like this. And that's about all I have for them at the moment. This is a picture of my mother at graduation, high school graduation. She's a mighty fetching little gal. And I'm glad to have that, because I don't know, I see her as a girl. It's the only one like that. Now, here we have a picture of she and my dad at their wedding. That's their wedding photograph. And that was in 1911 when that was taken. And then following that is the first results of their marriage, and that is me. I don't know whether you could call me a cute baby or not, but I'm a baby at that stage of the game, and less than 1 year old, I think, considerably less. 1912, the year I was born. There were a lot of other important things besides my birth that happened that year. However, the biggest piece of news was a tragic piece of news, and that is the sinking of the Titanic, which was a tremendous big liner that was on its maiden voyage to America from England, where it was built, with 1,500 people, I beg your pardon, over 2,000 people on board. And it hit an iceberg and sunk in about 2.5 hours, and 1,500 of those people died. And the rest were rescued in one form or another. The real tragedy, which here in this date of 1890. What is
What's the date today?
No, 1998. 1998. I'll get there. We are now seeing a movie made about it, a very, very pretentious movie, which did a wonderful job of the whole thing, and has gone to the top of the charts in almost every way.
Why do you say pretentious movie?
Well, I don't know. Pretentious is, I mean, it's a real extravaganza. Maybe that's a better term. In other words, they didn't spare the horses. They didn't spare the money. They put everything into this thing, and it showed. It really was quality. But anyhow, besides the sinking of the Titanic, Arizona and New Mexico became states of the Union. And we had our celebration. I'm getting a little confused here now. Taft was our president, and Wilson was going to follow him. In fact, in 12, he was nominated for the next president. And the 8th-hour day began for the first time with the federal employees. Prior to that time, everybody was working 10 or 12 hours, 6 days a week. Can you imagine that? And thank the Lord they broke the ice in 1912 by the 8-hour day, and it wasn't too long after that the 8-hour day was prevalent in all works of endeavor.
Was it always, did people always work for an hourly wage then?
Most working people worked out for hourly wages, yeah, with the exception of farm hands, of course. They didn't. They worked by the month or something like that, and got paid and roomed and board at the farm that they worked and so forth. That was a little different type of deal. But anyone that worked in normal type of occupations, any commercial or manufacturing industry, anything like that, was on an hourly basis. And so your question is, well, gee, many Christmas, isn't that a reduction in the amount of take-home pay? I don't know whether that was necessarily the case. I think they simply spread the salary of the given salary over a lesser number of hours, which in a sense is giving them a better pay per hour than that they had. And but for the good of humanity, it's a good thing it happened,
So
because
regardless of how many hours they worked, they got paid per hour. Does that mean, did some people work extra hours so they could then get extra pay?
I don't think they had such thing as overtime in those days. I think if they did work overtime, they just got straight additional hourly wage. If they earned 50 cents an hour, they just got 50 cents. They didn't get 75 cents or time and a half for the extra hours. I think the overtime, time and a half pay came along quite a bit later. I don't think they had it yet in the 30s, as a matter of fact. I think it started during the early war years, in the 40s. That's my guess, but I don't think I'm too far off. But anyhow, also the Girl Scout Association, or Girl Scouts of America, was founded in 1912. And the cherry trees in Washington that are around the lake in Washington, we see pictures of them all the time when they're in blossom. They were planted there first in 1912. And another earth-shaking event in 1912 was the Oreo cookie was invented. And we all still enjoy them. And that is the extent of the things that happened during that year that I made notes of and remember. But other than that, 1912 was, I suppose, could be called an ordinary year. Conditions were good. Most of the people were working and had jobs, and no bad storms or anything else to disrupt the calm nature of life in those days. And
Well, since you mentioned remembrances of things like that, did you have Oreo? Do you remember eating Oreo cookies?
no, I
as a
don't
kid?
remember them. I don't remember them then. The cookies I remember as childhood that I loved was a cookie that was with a marshmallow on top and then dipped in chocolate. So it was chocolate marshmallow cookie, and I think you've eaten them too.
Yeah.
They're still in vogue. But boy, I used to like those. And next door to us at Grandma's house was a man by the name of Mr. Senier. He was an elderly man, but he was superintendent at the Independent Baking Company in Davenport. And I envied that man above everybody else in the world because he could dip into the cookies anytime he wanted to. You know, I had no job better than that anywhere to be found. But and he was a nice old guy, and once in a while he'd bring some cookies home and we'd share them. But how did we get on cookies anyhow? Oh,
Well,
on the Oreos.
Following that vein, in that time, were most of the things that you bought, like when you bought candy or cookies or things like that at stores, were they packaged from other parts of the country, or were they packaged locally and sold locally?
Well, we had candy bars, and they were packaged by the plants where they build them, like Baby Ruth. Well, actually, those things came longer. The candy bars weren't in 1912. The candy bars
Well,
were
when you were
in
growing
the
up,
20s.
in your teens,
Yeah.
were there? I mean, as a kid, did you have candy bars and candy and?
Oh yes, we did. We certainly did.
Look at that.
Gosh.
Well, what my question is, like, I'm just interested in knowing where the candy came from that you would get.
Oh,
at
that's what we
stores.
were. That's
I mean,
what we
was
were
it
on. We were on
locally
candy.
produced and then you bought it, or would it come in from other places?
Well, candy was made all over the country, and it was brought in just as any other thing would be from other parts of the country by railroad or whatever to meet the demand that we had there in Davenport and so forth. And a lot of it was just in bulk. In those days, we had a lot of, well, I don't know whether you remember this or not, but they had something that looked like a peanut that was made out of marshmallow. It was usually, you remember those? Well, those kind and gumballs and jelly beans and all kinds of other little things like that were usually in the bulk. They'd buy a whole thing, and then when you bought it, if you wanted a nickel's worth, they'd weigh out a nickel's worth. And a nickel's worth bought you a pretty good bundle back in those days. And now you'd be lucky to get a jelly bean for a nickel. But that's the way. Like I say, the candy bars, I guess starting in the 20s, they started to come out with candy bars with wrappers on them, everything, right from the plant. And some of the earlier one was Baby Ruth, and I'm trying to think of some that are still prevalent today. Mars Bar, I think, and I'm not a candy eater. I've forgotten. At those days I was, but I've forgotten. So but anyhow, that's the style.
We'll talk about, I know in some parts of the world still, especially in like third world countries and stuff like that, I'm going to have to stop this. Someone's at the door.
Oh.
Or someone's coming up to the door.
Oh, that's my neighbor, I think. What are you doing home? Come on in. I'm having my picture taken.
Oh, you are.
You've met my grandson, haven't you?
Yeah.
Brian?
How's it going?
good.
Mike, he's doing my life on film.
Oh, why not?
So, what's a cooking? What are you
What's
doing
it
home?
cooking? What I'm doing home? As of 2 hours, I'm not working for SCT anymore.
How come?
They shut down my department.
Well, couldn't
Not
they
enough
put you into
bus-
something else?
Not at my price.
Oh, he's in computer repair.
Oh,
I think he's the one that helps me in all my problems.
Yeah.
And you'll have plenty of time to do that now, won't you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you'll get something else now.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah,
I'm all right for a couple of months or so, so it's no
yeah.
big deal.
Well, it shouldn't. Jesus, shouldn't it
It
take you
shouldn't
long?
take very long
It's
to
more a matter for you to make a selection of where you want to be than
Exactly.
yeah.
No, I was somewhat anticipating this. I was hoping it would be another month or so off because I wanted to refinance the house first.
Yeah.
I guess that's probably going to go down the toilet for
Well,
a while.
without a job, it'd be a little difficult. But shoot, I don't think you have any worries about it. That's
So-
a surprise, though.
What are you doing? Sitting here and
I'm sitting there in
telling
the corner.
life story?
Yeah, and he's shooting pictures, and then I run out of things to say, and he tips me off and asks me some more questions. Oh,
It's
dear.
an oral history.
Yeah.
That's what,
Why not?
what I'm calling it.
Mm-hmm. It's good. I want to see it when it's done.
Well, it'll be a while. He can only shoot on Fridays, and only this isn't his equipment. This is the school's equipment. He's teaching too, and so sometimes even there's Fridays he can't get the equipment. So, and each time we shoot, we get a net of what, about 15 minutes out of it, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, for
And the finished edited.
edited down version.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something
So it'll be a little while. Just don't get impatient.
No, I'm not holding my
yeah,
breath.
don't hold your breath. You still teach at MCC?
Oh, yeah. But that'll be over with in about, 3.5 weeks.
3.5 weeks.
Then the semester's over with.
Yeah.
Won't start again till August. If I could afford it, I'd take 2 months worth of vacation.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have fun.
What do you want to sit down and watch how this thing goes?
Oh, for
Just-
a little bit. I actually have a couple of things I need
Oh,
to
do you?
Yeah.
Do you? Well, we'll see a little more of you now for a while.
Most
for a while,
likely.
anyhow.
Most likely.
Okay. Incidentally, we liked your barley soup.
You did.
That was good. Yeah.
Good.
And I think we still got some in your bowl there, but we'll get it cleaned out and get it back to you.
Yeah, it gets a little thick, but thinning it out a bit and putting a little bit more salt and pepper.
I like that. I like that pea soup
With
quality.
the barley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of
He's
like it too.
he's a cook besides the linguist.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he knows particularly all the German stuff.
Right. Well, just for my reference, what is Stein? I mean, as a German name.
Stein just means stone, nothing else.
What's Haas mean?
My name?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing really?
No.
Yeah.
Is Stein common? I mean, is that a common?
Yeah, it's fairly common.
We got a town in Switzerland, Stein. Beautiful little town right on the Rhine River. You know about that?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a pretty place. I adopted that right off the bat.
'Cause it's
In
beautiful.
fact, I got a little bell hanging on the front door that gal bought for me.
Well, you guys have fun.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll see you probably tomorrow or something.
Yeah. Okie dokie.
Good to see you.
See you later. Now, where were we now when we?
Well, I was starting to ask you a question about in other countries of the world right now, in third world countries and things like that, people still go to different stores to buy their to buy.
Oh, I see what
They-
you mean.
They go like
They go to the
I know
bakery and the
they-
butcher and
yeah,
the candlestick
bakery,
maker.
yeah.
Yeah,
But and now it's different. The
candlestick
bakery,
maker. Yeah,
and now it's different. But in other countries it's still that way.
yeah, that's
Like it
true.
was
In
the
Europe,
90s. But
that's true.
anyways,
You go to the baker and you go to the butcher, and well, you go to grocery stores for the other type of thing, canned goods and everything like that. But also you go to the produce place, and it amazed me over there because there's very, very few big markets like we have here. If you want to go shopping for the day, boy, you spend a day doing it because you got to go all over the place.
and was that how I assume that's probably how it was?
Yes,
You're-
exactly. Exactly. It's just that we have graduated, if you want to call it that. I don't know whether it's necessarily better. It's certainly a time saver to be able to get everything in one big market like we have today than it was in those days. But
In those days, how was it? I mean,
it was time consuming for one thing, and but it was a lot more friendly because every butcher and baker and candlestick maker had a need to keep these people coming, so they were nice to them, and very often they'd give you a little something. I remember every time I went into a market with somebody or by myself to buy something, get a little piece of sausage, and or a pickle, or some little gift like that, And as a kid, I was pleased no end, to get all that stuff. But it was really a time-consuming thing. And another thing you want to remember is transportation was more of a problem in those days. Most of the people went by public transportation, streetcars, trams, or whatever you might want to call them, downtown or wherever they wanted to go. And so they had to carry the packages around all over the place. As they bought them, they'd get more to carry and so forth. And I don't know, they had to buy bags. They had big bags with two little handles on them, about this deep, about this big. They could get one of those, probably a nickel or less. But anyhow, they could put a lot of things in that, and a lot of people carried those things around with them. But it was a problem. I mean, if you got meat and everything else in the bag and it's weighing about 7 or 8 pounds, you've got to haul that around because you got to go down the bakeries at 2 blocks down the street. You walk, get something there, and so on. It can be a real hassle.
Yeah.
That is, compared to what we have today. There was no hassle then because that was the only way. That was life.
Right.
And
But most people lived within a couple blocks of a bakery, of a butcher, of.
Well, yes and no. My grandmother's house was Grandma Franzen. It's got to differentiate between Grandma Franzen and Grandma Stein. But in this particular instance, they were both the same because they had a meat market 3 blocks away. They had a grocery store 1 block away, and they had a bakery. The bakery was about 6 blocks away. So usually we kids went to the grocery store and the butcher. The parents, that's one thing. We earned our keep in those days. We had to do some of the dirty work, like taking these trips all the way to 3-4 blocks or 8 blocks, whatever, to get something. But like I say, we didn't resent it too much because when we got there, we got a little something, and usually our friend would go with us or something like that. So we didn't mind it too much.
And then would you give yourself a little something more too sometimes, or not?
You mean out of the package?
Yeah, or out of the change, or.
Oh no, I'd never do that. It's something, morals were so different in those days. I mean, we didn't even think of doing such a thing. Never occurred to us. I could have a whole fistful of coin, and boy, And a nickel would buy me a candy bar, you know, if I just take a nickel out there. But it never occurred to me. Never, not only me, I was no different than anybody else. It was the way with most of us. And I think if we knew that somebody was snifting the nickel at a dime here out of money that wasn't belonged to him, why, we wouldn't think much of the guy. But we do a lot of begging. Hey, Mama, I want to go to the picture show. Toss 10 cents. Usually the retort was, if you wanted to go to the picture show, you earned the money. So if we were too young to go out and work for it, why, we'd do something around the house, wash the car or cut the grass, something like that. Always earned something. My kids had to do the same thing. I never gave them what do you call it? An allowance. They had to earn it. Of course, the work was menial. I just wanted them to work and to get the value of money, you know, that it didn't come easy. So, anyhow, that particular attitude started long ago.
Well, let's talk about some of your school, some of the things that, like, what school was like as you went through school. How did it start out? And then just kind of take us through your whole experience of school from whenever you started. I don't know, kindergarten? I don't know if they had kindergarten.
I started in kindergarten, yeah. I'll never forget my first day of kindergarten, first day of school. We were living with my grandmother and Grandpa Franzen at the time. I was 5 years old. And, or was I 6? I guess I was 5. Usually they started kindergarten at 5. And so Mom took me up to Taylor School, which was about 3 blocks away. And I was a little apprehensive at first. But after being in school there with the kids and so forth, I got interested. I can still remember that day quite well because I had a big sandbox where we played in and all kinds of toys to play with and everything, and they were taught us to sing songs and so forth. Happy birthday to you, and something about good morning to you, good morning to you. And but anyhow, on this first day, I was in there, I don't know how long, probably an hour, hour and a half, and I had to go to the bathroom. Big bathroom, not little bathroom. And I was crossing my legs and jiggling up and down, but I wouldn't go or ask about it. I was just deathly afraid to let anybody know what condition I was in, my teacher or anybody else. And so finally, I went out the door and I started home. And I got halfway home and all hell broke loose. So when I walked in the house, I'm leaving a trail. And boy, Mom, she couldn't figure that out. Why in the world didn't you tell him you had to go to the bathroom? You know, why did you do a thing like this? And so I couldn't explain it. It just, you know, I was frightened. You don't tell everybody about your bathroom needs, you know, especially as a kid and especially back in those days. You weren't so vociferous of things of that nature. But anyhow, I got all cleaned up and I was just in fine shape after a while, you know. But speaking of my school experiences, that's one way to begin. And so anyhow, I stayed at Taylor School through the 2nd grade. We lived with my grandmother and granddad at length of time. Now wait a minute, until I was 8 years old. So that was about 3 years. Then Mom married Charles Abbey, Charlotte's dad. And I was 8, and they bought a place down on 4th Street, West 4th Street, 2126 West 4th Street, if you really want to know the address. And I started at Buchanan School, which was 2 blocks away, 2.5 blocks away. And although I was in the 3rd grade, they put me back in the second to find out how I fit in, whether I had the smarts to stay where I was. So, but in a week they put me in where I belonged in third grade, and I went all through sixth grade there. And I had my one and only fist fight while I was there. There was a bully in the school, and I wasn't the only one that got crosswise with him. And I guess by that time I was, probably 9 years old or something. And I'd never fought. Nobody had ever told me to put up my dukes. I never had any experience like that. We would wrestle as kids, but not fist fights, see. And so I don't know. I did something to this character at one recess period, and it got his goat. I think he was waiting for an opening, because he had pummeled a lot of the other guys, but he hadn't gotten around to me yet. So anyhow, the next thing I know, here I got fists flying at me. I'm covering myself up, trying to. I'm not making any effort to fight back. I'm just trying to cover myself up. I don't know anything about this fighting game. The teacher saw this thing going on and stepped in, and that was the end of that. But that was the one and only fist fight I ever had. I came close to having another one with one of the kids that lived right next door to me, or 2 doors from me, Clarence Gilbert, down on 4th Street. And he was a kind of a snotty type of guy, and he was a good friend of mine. But he'd do some things that really get you mad, And there's a guy that might take a nickel. He had less. It didn't bother him much to do something like that. But anyhow, I remember coming home from school one day. I can't remember what it was all about, but finally he just got my goat, and I just lost my temper. And I started after this guy, and actually I'd been afraid of him because he was a little bigger than I was. And I started after him, and he saw the expression on my face, and he turned and ran up on somebody's front porch. My only victory. But he didn't bother me anymore. It's surprising how they can learn their lesson. And another thing too, I felt so elated. I'd taken that guy, and that was a great feeling. That didn't happen often with me. But anyhow, at Davenport, Buchanan School, I went through 6th grade there, and I remember my fifth grade teacher, and I'll always remember. She was a red-haired lady by the name of Mrs. Culver. But she was, in my estimation, what every teacher should be. And every teacher can't, because she was perfect. She kept us all interested in what we were doing. She had a great interest. She had a great interest in each one of us individually. And she'd give everybody a chance to say something, if they wanted to speak, and held their hand up, yes, and she'd treat them like on the same level as she was, And she taught us not only schooling, but she was always giving us a little lesson on etiquette and honesty and various other things like that. And we got so, she was like a Bible to us, because we just appreciated everything she said. What a wonderful woman. That's one of the few that I had in my life that I'll never forget. But it was a fun time going through that stage from the 3rd to the 6th grade when I was there. And then I went to West Intermediate School, which was a middle school, they call it now. Those grades were from 7th through 9th, and then 10th you went to high school. And I had, we were taught spelling and penmanship in those days. This was by the same teacher in this one grade, which happened to be a short-tailed relation of ours called Anna Struve. She was a sister of the
Two
one
names, Anna Struve?
Anna was her first name, Struve was her last name. And she was a sister of now I can't think of her name, Hilda Struve, who gave me my name Victor Hugo, as a matter of fact. Mom, this is going back again, but anyhow, Mom had hoped for a girl. So she had dozens of girls' names, no boys' names. So anyhow, apparently, the only way I can gather is in this quandary of not being able to have a name or something, this Hilda come and visit her in the hospital. You know, well, back in those days, the women all spent 10 days in the hospital after a birth. And so during that period, she came there and wanted to know the name, and Mom says, I don't have one. And so she says, I have a name, Victor Hugo, and Hugo is my uncle Hugo Franzen. She says, I don't know what she said, but the story gets down to she didn't have any particular name for Victor, or any reason for Victor, but Hugo was my uncle. So she came with Victor Hugo. How it happened, I don't know.
Was it from the author?
Well, the author, yeah. Well, the author carried some weight, too, because they were familiar with Victor Hugo, the author. And so that probably had something to do with it. But it didn't do any good for my writing abilities, I don't think, later on. But anyhow, Anna Struve taught spelling and penmanship. And she demanded that you keep your mind on your work, you know, don't talk, don't whisper, don't this, you know, the what am I trying to say? Everybody had to toe the mark, that's what I'm saying. What in the world is it? Strict. Strict is a good word, yeah. She was strict. But I, during that period, always liked to talk to somebody. And so I'd find myself talking to somebody like this or something, and she'd catch me at it. And she'd say, Victor, cut that out, or something, whatever. And I got quite a few of those, and then one night I had to stay after school and write something on the board. That was one of the punishments in those days. I will not talk in class. Write it 100 times on the blackboard, or something like that. And so anyhow, then the word gets home to my family, my mother and so forth, that I was naughty in Aunt Anna Struve's class. I never called her Aunt Ann in school, of course. And so I better straighten out. And so I knew that the word was getting home, that I'd had to stay after school for being naughty. But anyhow, she, like most of the teachers in those days, taught you something. You'd learn something. She learned how to spell pretty well. Back in those days, the language is taught by syllables. It's what's the term for that now?
Phonics?
Yeah. And it was much easier to learn. And it was taught not only to learn to speak it, but learn to spell it. And another thing, too, everybody writes like this. But the teaching then, and it's good, and it's good just today, is that you rest and you don't move your fingers, you move your wrist. You write like this. And it's so much easier to do a good job writing like that, but I don't do it anymore either. It's an acquired type of writing. But once you acquired it, you can write beautifully. She wrote just beautifully, even on the blackboard. She'd go the big way rather than using the fingers. And so anyhow, that was one of my teachers in junior high school. What else can I tell you about that? I got interested in sports in a modest type of way. I never have been big on sports, but I went out for track. And later on in high school, I did it. I went out for track again and played a little football, but wasn't very good at it. I played a little basketball too. And also, what sports I included YMCA. I was a member of the YMCA for 3 or 4 years. I really enjoyed that. We had a YMCA downtown, and the reason I got into it is because the YMCA was trying to get sponsors to sponsor poor kids and give them memberships in the YMCA. And I was one of the poor kids, and my sponsor was Dr. Siverud, who my Aunt Charlotte had worked for. My Aunt Charlotte told him about me, and so he said, fine, I'll put him in. So anyhow, he kept that up for me about 3 years, and I really appreciated it because I loved the YMCA. Learned how to swim. I became pretty good at swimming. I won some contests. But that's the only thing in sports that I ever acquired any technique at all. Now I'm getting
in those years, in your junior high years, then you say you did a little sports, but so what was your after school activities then?
After school activities, what were they? Well, I think, I'm talking about school sports. I'd probably go home and we'd play baseball out in the sandlot or out in the pasture back at my grandmother's. Things like that. That's one thing we'd do, which is quite often. We would play our own sandlot type baseball or football, whatever the season might be. But as going out for the team at high school and junior high school, I played basketball in junior high school. And I played a little football in high school, but I wasn't very good at it. I've never been, I don't have the coordination that's necessary to be a good athlete. I know that. I still don't have it. I play golf, but I'll never be good because I don't have the drive and the competitiveness in sports. My tendency is to say, well, if I'm not doing so well, so what, instead of, I'm going to get him, I don't have that drive. That competitiveness, not in sports, but I've had it all my life in other things, but not sports.
Well, then, so you did play sports a lot, but just with friends around the neighborhood.
That's right.
Things like that.
Yeah, and both on 4th Street and up at my grandmother's house on 13th Street, there were enough kids around that we could always get up a ball team. And in fact, we had a pretty darn good ball team. We called ourselves the Whippets, and we had no leagues. There was no organization. We would just get together, and so our gang was called the Whippets. Somebody else would be the Bulldogs or something. It'd be a gang of kids on the other side. And sometimes they just get a gang together to play, just to compete. And so that's the way our baseball went. We did everything ourselves. The adults had nothing to do with it. Like now, Little League, adults are the brains. The kids are simply the mechanism by which the game is played. But with us, we did everything. I mean, we made our own baseball diamonds, made our own backstops, and we worked to buy our own gloves. And unfortunately for us, though, we had one guy up on 13th Street there, by my grandmother, Dick Knut, was one of the gang, and he had a wealthy family. He came from a wealthy family, and Harry Runge, his uncle, they had a very successful mortuary, so he had a lot of money, and always driving big cars. And so Dick, all he had to do was tell Uncle Harry that he needed a ball glove or he needed this or that. Uncle Harry provided it. Well, in time, Dick had provided half the team with gloves and balls and bats, through Uncle Harry, And so we were very thankful for him, and I was particularly because I was one of the poor kids, and so was Frank, of course, and there were others in the neighborhood. But anyhow, I'm glad we had that experience of we had to fight our own battles, have our own umpires, and we'd always have a squabble. Was he safe? Was he out? And things like that. But we managed to arbitrate and play the game, and it was a lot of fun. We really enjoyed it. And I really feel sorry for these kids today in these little leagues because they don't have that demand on their brains. Their parents are doing everything for them. And all the kids are doing is getting out and doing the physical part of it. So I'm glad for the days that I went through that.
Did you follow the professional sports leagues when you were
in interest?
That age, like in junior high age?
No, I never did too much. The only one, Uncle Ed Franzen, he was a pitcher for one of the semi-pro leagues. I don't think it was even pro. I think it was amateur, but they had uniforms. Somebody was sponsoring because they all had uniforms and everything else. And he's a pretty good pitcher, I guess, because they won a lot of games. But we followed up Uncle Ed wherever his team played and everything else. But yeah, we'd know about the Cubs in Chicago, Cubs, and a few other teams around. The Chicago Cubs was the most favored team in Davenport because it was the closest one to us. Chicago was just 180 miles away, but St. Louis would be the next closest. That was over 200. So our interests always were with the Cubs and Chicago, And also when football came in, Chicago side again, And they still are. The Davenport people are still big on Chicago. So, back in those days, we were aware that those teams existed and followed them to a degree, And especially when they were in the playoffs, the World Series and things like that. That's an interesting thing, too. Back in the days before radio and TV, of course, the newspaper was the only source of information. Well, you play a ball game on the World Series, for example, on Tuesday afternoon. That's too late for evening papers to publish. They can't even publish it. And so what they did, they put up a big baseball diamonds on the outside of their building. And it was like a triangle, or like a square, like a baseball diamonds, like this and everything. And they had guys up there that would move the ball around. They'd listen to it by phone and find out what it was and put the action on that big board. And here there'd be a whole crowd standing out, baseball fans standing out in the street there watching this thing. That was the crude way they got the message across of what was going on.
Where was that? In front of what building?
Well, they did that in front of the Democrat, the newspaper that I'd worked on later on. And on the Times, too, the opposite. Both of them were owned by the same outfit, but the Times was one place and the Democrat was another, two different.
So would they say the names of the players who were getting the hits?
Yeah, that's right. They'd put a card up. Who was up to bat? They'd put that card up, and then they'd take it down, put another card up. Yes.
They go pitch by pitch, or just batter by batter?
No, they wouldn't go pitch by pitch. It was whenever there was any movement. When a guy had made for a run for, I don't know whether they couldn't show how the ball where it went out. They'd have to. There was so much they couldn't do.
Right.
But nevertheless, there was some action up there, and we were advised of what the circumstances were at that game,
Right.
Who was winning. And so it drew a lot of people. And I remember when they first put that up there, boy, everybody in town wanted to see that. They thought it was great. We were satisfied with so much less in those days than they are today.
Oh, you had no choice.
Well, no choice and didn't know any better either.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Did they only do that for World Series games, or did it start?
yeah, I think it only was the World Series games because it was the big awkward thing. It was right on the main street, and they had to block out part for people to stand in front of it, so the traffic had to kind of go around them. So they didn't do that too often. But the World Series was a big enough event that they would do it then.
And so they got actually blocked traffic right with
Yeah,
everything
right.
out there. Did so people were interested. Obviously, people were really interested in baseball.
Yeah, yeah.
Was there? I don't know for sure. What was the interest in other professional sports compared to baseball?
Well, baseball was by far the most important game because everybody played baseball. The kids played baseball. Then when they grew up and the high school had baseball, high school teams playing against each other. And then after you get a little bit older, then you get into one of these leagues my Uncle Ed was in, you know. And if you weren't playing baseball, you were out pitching it, plowing it back and forth with a friend of yours, you know. And baseball was big. And well, of course, we played baseball right from scratch when we were, well, I guess we started playing baseball when we were 8 or 9 years old. Football we started playing when we were about 4 or 5 years older than that. So furthermore, there wasn't football. There wasn't even the college universities. You see, the thing is, we had no radio. Radio came in and started handling these games probably about 1927 or 1928. So prior to that, we don't have knowledge of these teams. So the teams don't have that great. See, now somebody playing, we can all over the country we can hear about it, you know. And so I think they played football in colleges, because I remember pictures of football teams I've seen, and there's crazy little uniforms they used to have and everything else. I remember, so if they shot pictures of them, they were playing. But it didn't have the universal appeal that baseball did. It was the amount of fans were much less than the baseball fans. And basketball was, I don't know, they might have had college competitions, but nobody really knew anything about them. The sports were baseball, and they had horse racing. I don't know of anything else that had a general appeal in the way of sports that was organized. There was sports that weren't organized. For example, ice skating. Whenever the rinks or lakes were frozen, everybody ice skated, and various things like that. It was just purely unorganized. There was a lot of that.
Do you remember playing hockey at all, or was that?
Well, some people played hockey, but there again, that wasn't organized either. You just get a tin can and start beating it. We'd kick the can too in the summertime, you know, just on the street. But
And marbles? Did you ever get into
marbles, I was one of the best, I'll have you know. That was at Buchanan School.
middle school?
No, before middle school. This was in grade school, and I was pretty good. I was one and they didn't want to play with me too much because I usually won, and I'd get a bag full of these things, and some of the real pretty. They were glass, you know, and or agates, and so forth. Very pretty. But anyhow, I got a little aside to tell you about. There was a German kid that came to our school directly from Germany, and this is the first experience he had at school here. And he wanted to play marbles too, but he wasn't so good. He was losing to me and everybody else. But the thing is, he had a bicycle, and I didn't have a bicycle. And I love to ride a bicycle. So I made a deal with him. I said I'd give him what I won the 5 days of school, so that on Saturday he could go down. The kids still had marble games on Saturday around the school. And so I'd give him that if he'd let me ride his bike while he was playing marbles. Yeah, good deal. So for several, I don't know how many, but several Saturdays, I rode that bike, and I had the time of my life on that thing. And he'd lose the marbles again. And so the next week I'd have to give him more. I was his source of supply, and consequently I got to ride his bike. But anyhow, I remember one Saturday I was on that bike, and I'm heading, the road splits, and the left-hand one goes down a hill, and the other one went straight ahead. Well, here comes the girl, one I was very fond of in school, that was walking along there the street, and here I am with my bicycle. And I say, boy, I got to show off, see. So I take my hands off the wheels, you know, and I must have hit a rock or something. But anyhow, the next thing you know, I'm sprawled all over the street in front of her, and so is the bicycle. And anyhow, I get that back over to school to Hans, and I say, look what I did. Oh, my. I don't know what my parents are going to say. Well, we found out what the parents said. Don't lend that kid that bicycle anymore. So that was the end of that, Ray. But
So you never quite impressed the girl, huh?
no, I don't think so. No, I did just the opposite. I impressed her, but in the wrong way. But I finally got a bike of my own. I never could save enough money to get it. But my Uncle Ed, who realized my plight, he said, well, he says, I don't know whether he said, I'll give you $6 or whether the bike that I found cost $6. But there was a limitation on how much money that he could give me to get it. But I found a bike for $6 in a bicycle shop downtown. I was getting ripped off. I know now, but I didn't at the time. This is my bicycle. You know, it had a bad tire on it, and no fenders, and no bell, no extra stuff. All it had was a frame, the handlebars, and two wheels, and the sprocket. That was it. And looked bad. With a bad deal. But $6. So I paid it. And he pumped the tires up for me, and I took off, and I go about 8 blocks, and all of a sudden I find out this one tire is getting flat. And so I had to find a filling station where they had free air, you know, for the automobile tires. And I'd fill it up again. I'd go about 8 more blocks without air again. And so I got, by the time I get home, it's out of air again. And my mother's a little disappointed, but with it. But I wasn't. I said, gee, I got a bike, you know. And Forrest Reed, my next door neighbor, had just a year or so before that, his dad had got him a new Deluxe. Deluxe was the name of the bike, a beautiful thing with beautiful handlebars, and a place in the back where you could put stuff, you know, a little rack, and a horn or a bell with your ring, and all those goodies. And
would they paint them different colors?
Oh yeah, they were all painted. Those Deluxe were pretty good bikes. They really looked nice. And so anyhow, that one of mine was a mess. But anyhow, Bud had, among other things, he had a kit for fixing the tires, you know. So he fixed my tire for me, and I got over that problem. And it served its purpose all right. I had a lot of fun. I could ride where anybody else rode, you know, and so forth. So that was my first bike.
Well, you mentioned you moved to different neighborhoods. Were the schools always within walking distance of where the kids lived?
Yeah.
And so were they always pretty small schools?
Well, small schools. there were two-story schools as a rule, and some had basements. Yeah, Buchanan School was 2 stories plus basement. And I don't know what else they had down in the basement except that they had the boys' latrine down there. And probably the girls were too, I don't know. But I don't know what you mean by small or large.
Well, I'm just saying, I mean, nowadays they have these huge schools that serve 1,000 kids.
No.
And they bus them in from all
Yeah,
over.
no, we didn't bus them in. We walked. We walked, and sometimes the walk was quite far. Now, just 2.5 blocks from 4th Street, where we lived on 4th Street, to Buchanan School. Taylor School was about 2.5 blocks. But when I lived at Grandma's later on in my life and went to J.B. Young Intermediate School and later on high school, I walked that distance. That was better than a mile, walked each way, which was not unusual. I mean, you walked to school regardless of where you lived. Every kid walked to school. There was no other way. Maybe some were lucky enough to have their dad bring them or take them or somebody in their car. But most of the kids walked. It was standard practice. Of course, the thing is, there were nearly as many automobiles on the street back in those days. It was a much quieter deal all the way around, not nearly as dangerous. And nowadays, I can easily see why you wouldn't risk sending your kid to school if you had to cross Baseline or Dobson or some of these other busy streets. My gosh, it'd scare you to death to think your kid was walking across streets like that. So probably the bus is the only way of doing it.
No, I lost my train of thought. Questions keep going through and then I lose it.
Yeah.
One that I did remember though was when you were talking about German kid coming over when you were in elementary school.
Yeah.
Which would have been during World War I, probably.
No, World War I ended in 1918. I was 6 years old. I was at Buchanan. I started Buchanan School when I was 8.
So he came. Well, then he came after World War I. My question is,
Yeah.
what? You came from a German town.
Yeah.
And obviously Germany was kind of the center of World War I.
Yeah.
What were the Germans and American? The Germans in America, what were their feelings about what Germany was doing?
Well, their feelings were mixed, the Germans and Americans, and they were somewhat apprehensive too, because there was a lot of Americans that took exception to Germans that lived here, even though they were citizens, because they were German. You know, if you had a German name, people kind of looked down their nose at you. You know, and of course in those days, a lot of people had a lot of their relatives still in the old country, because back in those days, a great many people were immigrants to America yet. Right. And in fact, there were some German stores that were windows busted and things like that, or signs put out and things. They got treated pretty roughly. And it was a sad thing too. And there was same thing happened to the Japs, American Japanese, during Second World War, when we put them in prison camps. That was a bad thing to do.
Well, your name is obviously very German. Did you have any personal experiences, or your family, with problems like that?
No, not personally.
How did the Germans feel about what Germany was doing? The Germans that were here in America.
Well, the Germans,
like your family and
Germans were here in America, were American. They believed in what America was doing and looked down their nose at what Germany had done. I mean, Germany started that war. At least that's was the popular belief, but actually it was a combination of circumstances there. Before the First World War, there was a lot of strife between various countries there. They're all, many more little ones, and they were all fighting amongst themselves. And finally, it just got such a tangle of allegiances over there that something blew it. That's when the guy got killed at Sarajevo. That was Franz Joseph somebody or other. They was assassinated, and that
Sarajevo.
blew the lid off.
You were obviously very young during World War One, but do you remember people that came back from World War One? What did people talk about as far as World War One?
Well, I don't remember anybody coming back and talking about World War One. I suppose you're talking about soldiers that came back. No, I don't remember that. I was either too young or they weren't talking. I don't know which. I never had to serve in the services because, as you know, I was with Lockheed all during the Second World War. So I never was in the services at all in my entire life. So I wouldn't know what the reaction would be other than what I've heard. And what I've heard is that if you are really in the bad situations in war, seeing people killed all around you and everything else, you just don't want to talk about it. You just want to forget it. And I think that might have been the case in a lot of it, because that was the bloody hand-to-hand war that for First World War. Millions of soldiers, and mostly soldiers and sailors. In those days, they spared the cities more or less. They fight in the country. It's not like in World War II where they bombed the cities. You know, that was horrible. But where they didn't lose as many civilians, they lost loads and loads of soldiers and sailors in the First World War. So they didn't do a lot of talking about it. It wasn't a pleasant thing. And but as far as what do I remember about the First World War, I lost my father, for one thing, in the flu epidemic. He was at Fort Dodge in Des Moines when the flu epidemic struck, which was a horrible thing. It killed 20 million people over the world. And besides that, why, I remember we had to save some of the craziest things. We had to save tin foil. We had to save peach stones. These are all things to help the war effort, see? And why those things, now I wonder, why peach stones and why tin foil and what were some of the other stuff? I guess tires, old tires. Well, they did that in the Second World War, but that didn't do any good. I think it was more in an effort to let us suffer, to know that war is a horrible thing. They took our tires and stuff away in the Second World War, and I think that's probably had something to do with the First World War. It would eliminate the use of cars. When your tires blew away, you didn't drive anymore. You suffered. I think that was it, kind of a psychological deal more than anything else. Because
Really?
I think so. Because what do they do with those old tires? My gosh, even today with our technical abilities to make the most out of everything, we have billions of tires laying all over this country. No, everybody wonder what are we going to do with them. So back in those days, I don't know what they'd do with the worn out tires.
So when the tires got wore out, you had to turn them in?
Yeah. Well, you couldn't get more. You
Oh, you
couldn't
couldn't
get
get
more. No, you had to turn them in. That's right. You had to turn the tires in. But I remember some of the songs of the First World War. There were some pretty catchy tunes. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy, keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Late last night in the pale moonlight, I saw you, I saw you. Fritzy boy is a German.
Yeah.
Keep your head down, Fritzy boy, keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Something about if I see you, you're going to get shot. You know? He was a Fritzy boy with a German. And there was a lot of tearjerker songs like "How I Miss You" and how I'd like to be home again, and various other ones. There was a lot of good music came out of that war, as was true with the Second World War. We had a lot of very good music come out of there. But I was 6 when the war ended, so there's not an awful lot that I can remember of it.
Well, I cut you off when you were talking about your school, and you mentioned the name of where you went to high school.
Well, I went to.
Continue on your going back to the vein of school, because that's what
Okay.
we were.
Well, let's see. I
High
told you
school.
about West Intermediate. I went first, since I lived on 4th Street, I went to West Intermediate School, school. And then the house was too small for us. When Charlotte came along, I was 12 years old. And the house was too small, and furthermore, I wasn't getting along with my stepdad too well. And so there was a little bit of friction there, plus the loss of, with the 2-bedroom, you know, it was pretty crowded. So it was decided that I would go up and live with Grandma and Grandpa Franzen up on 13th Street, which I had no objection to either, because I loved it up there. And then, of course, I'd lose all my good friends down in 4th Street, but I still had a gang of, I was lucky that way. I had two gangs of guys on 13th Street and on 4th Street. And so I moved up with Grandma and Grandpa, and when I did, then I had to go to J.B. Young Intermediate School. That's the one I mentioned earlier. I had to walk a mile or more to go to school. And that was a pretty long haul sometimes in winter when it's below 0 weather and the sidewalks aren't cleaned or anything else. It's a job to get there. But anyhow, I can only remember one teacher. She was a tall, thin gal by the name of Mrs. Speetson, and she taught mathematics. Arithmetic is the term I'm trying to say, because mathematics covers the whole shebang. Arithmetic is the fundamental things. And she was a nice gal, and I don't know particularly why I should remember her above any of the others, but well, I remember others too as far as that goes. But anyhow, I can't think of anything about J.B. Young Intermediate School that rings any bells, except that it was the stage of my life when I started becoming interested in girls. And I remember I used to write notes back and forth to the girls and slip them, you know, across from one table to the counter desk to the other. And I walked down the hall with them and things like that, and had flutters of puppy love going through my veins. And of course at high school that developed to a little greater and finer sense, you know. But it was a good school and I enjoyed it. Oh, there was one thing I remember there. We had our seats two together like this, and then there'd be an aisle and 2 more together like that. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but anyhow, in regard to colored people, didn't I mention something about the... Anyhow, Herman sat next to me. He was black. And we got along real well. And I was crazy about airplanes back in those days. And so I played. Sometimes I was a pilot, he was a co-pilot. Sometimes it was reversed, you know. I don't know how we reversed it and how we decided, but we got along fine. And I don't know why that sticks with me, but it does. I guess he's a pretty good pal of mine. And anyhow, then I went to high school.
Well, going on that, you said you were crazy about planes. Did you make model airplanes? Did you collect pictures of planes, or was it just an interest?
I got read magazines on airplanes. I wonder if I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I was 15. Let's see, in 15, normally I'd be in 10th grade, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
So maybe I'm getting a little, because When I was 15, I really got interested in aircraft, in airplanes. And that was brought about by Charles Lindbergh's flight from New York to Paris nonstop, which was a feat beyond, that's like now going to the moon, you know, because of the aircraft and what the type that they had then. And he did it solo by himself. Anyone else that tried it went with 2 or 3, a whole crew, you know. And he became a superhero. He is the superhero of all times for the United States. There's nobody that's ever eclipsed him in public acceptance, public hero worship than they did Charles Lindbergh. And he was a deserving guy. He was a real straight arrow, a real nice guy. He had been an airmail pilot before. He was young yet. He was in his early 20s. And so anyhow, I, along with everybody else, just get the flying bug. So I went out the airport then and bicycled out the airport. And that's another story. I don't know whether we want to go
Yeah,
in.
that's fine. Well, since we're on the vein, let's just...
Okay. I started riding out there at the airport and reading. Oh, and Ralph Stein is a very good friend of mine. He hit the bug just like I did, and so we were actually in high school. I was 15 then, so I must have been in 10th grade, something like that. And so we was reading all the magazines and everything else, and I was going out there. He didn't go out there, but I did. And so one day, I must have been 16. But one day I was out there and fooling around, and one of the guys come out, one of the pilots, one of the guys worked, I didn't know what he did. He was connected with the airport, came out, and he said, geez, these damn forms. He says, I sure wish I knew somebody that could do some typing. And I says, I can type. Because I had learned type. I had taken a year of it, I guess, in junior high school. And I took to it pretty good. And so he says, you can. I says, well, yeah, I can. He says, well, come on in here, kid. Let's see what you can do. So he put me to work on typing some of these forms and some of these other things, and I did a pretty good job. And finally he says, well, that's it, that's all. It's the end of it, and thank you very much. He said, incidentally, do you like to fly? And I was dumbfounded. How do I? Yes, I would like to fly. And he said, well, I'll tell you, I'm going up a little later. Would you like to go along? I said, yeah, sure would. So he fitted me up with goggles and everything else. And he was flying to keep his hours. You know, they have to put in so many hours of flight to get different licenses. And so he's just putting in his time. So anyhow, he gets me all rigged out, and we go up in this Curtiss Jenny, which was a World War I training plane. It was more like a box kite than anything else, but it worked. And so, geez, what a sensation. What a sensation. I just couldn't believe it. You know, you get up there and look down, and before, the only time I saw the Mississippi from a distance was up from a hill. Now I'm looking down, I can see Mississippi, I can see Rock Isle, Moline, the hills off into Illinois, and same way back. Just like a bird, you know. The sensation in a commercial ship now, where you're all boxed in and everything else, is nothing compared to that, with the wind blowing in your face and everything else, and every time you turn, you really go over like this, and boy, I'll tell you, I was just walking on air when I got down. I just thought that was the greatest thing ever. And so anyhow, it was Charles Curtiss was his name. And he took a liking to me, and I spent a lot of time out there, and I did a lot of work for him, and he took me flying a lot. He finally started giving me lessons. And I don't know, I can't remember how long I was doing this, but anyhow, I knew from my reading about airplanes and everything else and everything about them that I was doing besides, I was getting pretty sharp, and he realized that. And so he had me help do ground school training of students that they'd bring in there. And also it helped me fix wings and do various things like that. Boy, I'll tell you, that was great. I loved that. And anyhow, make a long story short, I finally was soloed in this same old rickety OX5 engined Jenny. And boy, what a thrill that was. And I had the whole doggone, everybody at the airport was standing out there watching me. And I brought it in and put the thing back down again, and joy, I'll tell you, I was really walking on air. That was super. And
That all happened in a year?
well, no, it was better than a year. I started out there when I was 15. I was almost 17 when I flew, and that is solo. So over a period of 2 years, but I didn't spend all my time out there, but I spent a lot of time out there, you know, because I had other things going. By that time, I was interested in music too, and interested in girls, and various other things. And so finally, well, and another thing too, I needed money, and I didn't get any money out there. Because, you know, when you're 16, 17 years old and you want to take a girl to a show or something, you have no money, you're in bad shape. Or she's expecting, I mean, your friends at school, she's expecting you, why don't you take me somewhere, you know? And I never had any money. So finally I had to give that up and spend all my spare time working for Gramp again in his construction business. And then I was loaded with loot because by the time I was 15 years old, I was doing a full man's labor and job, and he was paying me. I think we've gone over this before, so I won't dwell on it. But anyhow, I got into music, and we had a little band that we got together of people that went to school, my school chums, you know, they played in the band, they played in the orchestra, and I did too.
And when did that start? When did you start playing?
Well, I started taking banjo lessons when I was still carrying newspapers, which was probably 14 or something like that.
Well, and you didn't tell us about your newspaper job. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't?
No.
Well, I was a paper carrier. You know, I carried both for the Democrat and the Times over a period of 2 or 3 years, I guess.
Same time or just at different times?
At different times, yeah. Yeah, you can't cover more than one route at a time. First paper, I learned about the newspaper route because of a friend when I lived on 4th Street, a guy by the name of Merle Stormer, who had a Times route. And we became pretty good friends, and he told me and showed me what there was about carrying a route. And he worked for the Times, and the Times and Democrat varied in this respect as far as carriers were concerned. At the Democrat, you didn't have to worry about collecting. They sent somebody else out from the office that collected. Or they get it by mail. I don't know how they did it. But with the Times, we had to collect. The paper cost 15 cents a week for the subscription. But we had to collect that. And out of that 15 cents, we got 4 cents. That 4 cents is what we got for delivering that paper to that house all week long. So anyhow, he worked for the Times, which was the toughest because every Saturday morning you had to go out and make these collections. And a lot of times they get stood up. And boy, when you get stood up, then that means that the 4 cents you would get is gone, plus the fact that you owe the rest of it for people that, so you come up with a very, very abbreviated check unless, or cash, they didn't have checks, unless you get everybody paying. But Merle had a pretty good route. He didn't have too much trouble, and he had some spendable left over after he got through with his week. And so when I started the Democrat. I had my name in both places, but they called first. And so I met Vince Dorgan. Vince Dorgan was in charge of all of the, well, that's another difference. The Times would send a truck out and dump your bundle of papers at a certain corner every night. You'd pick them up there. But the Democrats, you had to go down on the streetcar. They give you chips that so you free ride down and pick them up down at and then take a streetcar out to your route. And so every day you're back down to the paper. And so Vince Dorgan became a big man in my life. He was a real sweetheart of a guy. He really knew how to treat those kids, and he treated them like a father, but also like a buddy, you know. He always chomping on a cigar. And so anyhow, I went to work for the Democrat, and the first route Vince gave me, he says, do you know anything about downtown? And I'd gone downtown with my grandmother and my mother a number of times. I knew where the stores were and everything around, so I said, yeah, I knew downtown. He says, fine, I'll start you out on this route. So it was about 50 papers to deliver, and he gave me a book with 50 different sheets in it, which had the address on each one, and in the continuity, which is followed the way you went around the route, see. But anyhow, I was in over my head on that deal because I didn't realize that there was apartments up over all of these stores and so forth, and the door of this apartment's here, and the door this one, and instead of having numbers like houses have, they have A, B, and C for the rooms and everything else. And my gosh! And then furthermore, this was a carbon copy of these things, and I couldn't hardly make out the reading. And here, I'm lost. Anyhow, I get through with the route, and I had about half my papers left. I couldn't find the rest of them. So I thought, well, I didn't think there was anything too wrong with that. I guess I wasn't too concerned. So I started walking home with the rest of the papers. I thought, well, I'll take them home, and I'll have dinner, and I'll come back down, and I'll try and sell them on the corner, see? And so I get down there, and I remember I'm walking close to the house, towards the house, and here's my mother frantically waving, come on, come on, come on. So I hurried, and she says, my gosh, there's a man, Vince is calling you. What happened to your route? Well, the people are screaming, they don't have their papers. And I said, well, I did the best I could. Call him, he wants you to call him. And so I called him, and he ate me out, and I remember I got mad at him because I didn't think this was my fault. This was a dirty trick he pulled on me, and that's the attitude I had. And so I said, what do you expect me to do? Can't read it, and I've never been up in these houses and anything else. You asked me whether I knew the town. Well, I knew where the theaters were and all that, but I don't know where these people are hiding down there in all these big apartments and things. And so he finally realized, and he says, well, that's fine. He says, that's okay. And don't worry, we'll take care of those people that haven't. You just throw the other papers away. We'll take care of that. And don't be late when you come in the morning or tomorrow, which is the same as saying, don't worry about it, you still got your job, I'm trying to think where my first route was for the Democrat, a regular route. Because I had several. Well, I guess it doesn't matter which one came first. But the one route I remember was I was living on 4th Street, same place, was with the Times, when I was carrying the Times, and I had to collect. And it was kind of a poorer end of town. And boy, I'll tell you, I wasn't getting it. And there was a couple weeks when I had worked for nothing, and Mom had to give me extra dollar so to cover my bill to the paper. And but sometimes it evened out, because even though they were late, why, the next week I'd get it, and so I'd have 15 cents more than I suffered the first week, but I made up for it the next week. But there was a lot of those suckers that did me out of it completely, and I don't know what the time's attitude was, but I guess it had to be that if they're not going to pay you, don't give them a paper, you know.
Yeah.
But after that, after 3 or 4 weeks there, you had worked there for nothing, you know, before you finally saw it off. I've got to talk my quit.